Thank you very, very much, Carl. I think we really benefited from your being able to join us this afternoon. We're going to spend the last hour of our afternoon with another round table, so I'd like to ask the speakers to come forward and sit with me here on stage. Thank you. We are joined, in addition to having Sophie Richardson, who spoke with us before, join us again. We are joined by young Jianli, whom Carl mentioned, a very active member of the Chinese democracy movement, being very culturally Chinese here with Professor Gladney, who joins us from California via Hawaii, I hear, professor of anthropology and longtime scholar of the situation of the Uyghurs in China. We also have Hans Hogrefe from the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission. We have Kara Abramson from the Congressional Executive Commission on China, and Bhuchung Tsering from the International Campaign for Tibet. I'm very, very happy that all of you can spend this time with us. I'd like to see if we can spend this time pursuing 3 questions, if possible. One is if we can explore anything that we need to know about where is China's Communist Party and PRC government policy going with regard to the Uyghurs and the Uyghur problem. Secondly, if we can talk a little bit about what we learn about the Uyghur situation by looking more broadly. Carl has, of course, connected the struggle for human rights among the Uyghurs with the struggle for human rights among the Chinese. Sophie, a little earlier this afternoon, mentioned the question of where are the overlapping concerns that Chinese and Uyghurs share in seeking a better life inside China. So areas of commonality, areas of difference, and finally what is to be done, what can be done. I'd like to ask and see whether Professor Gladney and perhaps Kara and Sophie can tell us something, and anyone else who wants to jump in. What is happening now with nearly a year, 10 months after the violence in July, major change in leadership in the Xinjiang party and government structure, and in national work meeting in Beijing, the Xinjiang Work Conference hosted by the president of the country. Can you tell us what was said and your analysis of that policy? I'd like to start. Who's been following that?
Well, to answer this question, I have to give a little bit of background about China's policy in the past 60 years. The CCP's rule in eastern Turkestan has undergone a number of different stages, but the core intention of the policy has never changed. That is to weaken, if not destroy, the identity of the Uyghur people to the extent that this culture factor will cease to be a political factor threatening CCP's rule over Greater China. That's the policy. That's the core intention of the policy. And the strategy is also very clear. So the strategy in pursuit of this policy is also very clear and well documented by many rights groups and institutions. That can be summarized in 5 words: deceive, dominate, dilute, divide, and demonize. Each one of them can break into different aspects. It's deceive, dominate, dilute, divide, demonize. The diluting policy is always on top of agenda, which we can go deeper, but I don't think time permits to elaborate. But the rest of the 4, which one has emphasis, depends on the situation. So this is the background. Okay, now we talk about the leadership change. So Zhang Chunxian is enjoying the reputation being the most open-minded provincial party chief. He has claimed to rule Xinjiang with a softer, more flexible policy than his predecessor. And he went to Xinjiang amid the newly raised up hope and expectation. He went to Xinjiang also with money. But the question is, can he change the core policy, which I just talked about? That's the number one question. Of course, we will see another round of economic growth. And maybe the people in the eastern Turkestan will rise in their standard of living. But the question is, can the Uyghur people benefit fairly and proportionately? And the more serious question is, we don't see any change in the party's mindset that they believe money works for all. So if I give you money, if I have economic growth, you must be happy. So the Uyghurs are being forced to be happy. It's not much different from a Tibetan situation. And another question is, I have to give you the background, the political structure in China. I give you the sequence of facts so they will understand. The party have a dominance in political life, number one. Number two, the party officials outrank governmental officials at corresponding ranks in the political hierarchy. So the party chief at different level, at all levels, have the final say in all the significant issues in the region. But in Eastern Turkestan, also we call Xinjiang, all the party chiefs of all levels are Han Chinese members. And we know each party chief around him a very complex nexus of interest group developed. Most of them are Chinese. That's one of the sources of economic discrimination come from. So my question is, can Mr. Zhang Chunxian destroy this structure? So that's my question. If you answer my question, you know what this policy is going. Thank you.
Thank you, Jianli. Kara, would you care to comment further, elaborate, or contradict?
Thanks. I will talk a bit about the Xinjiang Work Conference, which you raised, as that's certainly been on our minds in the past month or so. So this is, of course, a conference by top Chinese party and government officials to set development priorities for Xinjiang. And Hu Jintao authorities at the meeting stressed the two twin pillars of stability and development. And initiatives announced at this work forum are things like more infrastructure, construction, job creation, improved public services, a number of things that sound quite good, tax reforms, and also a continuation of programs to promote ethnic unity and border stability. So I would say in many respects it seems like a continuation of policies that we've seen before, but just at a much larger level. This, of course, is the first work forum for Xinjiang, Tibet. Of course, has had a number. A couple of things are notable. First, the government has pledged to focus attention on southern Xinjiang, which has a predominantly Uyghur, non-Han population. At the same time, it is also continuing to, and I should note that is not a new development, it's stressed that in past years. So it remains to be seen, of course, how it's implemented. At the same time, it's stressing this focus on southern Xinjiang. These development initiatives will also channel money to Bingtuan, the production and construction corridor, which are predominantly Han areas that have traditionally had sort of manufacturing, agricultural, and earlier border defense stability functions. So I think that's something notable that's been overlooked in some of the analyses. I would say one thing that's, I think as we look ahead to this, I do think it's worth asking whether such an ambitious program can indeed be implemented. It certainly seems the government is putting a lot of money into this, pouring a lot of resources and media coverage on the issue, but it is an extremely far-reaching program, and the Chinese government can't simply wave a magic wand and make these things happen. So I think we can't determine yet whether all of these goals will be reached. I think it's a moderately prosperous society by the year 2020. But at the very least, we see much more attention to the issue and much greater will. So Whether it will meet all of its objectives remains to be seen, but there certainly does appear to be a ramping up of a lot of the traditional kind of top-down problematic policies that we've seen, and certainly not all of it. We may see some economic growth benefits to the region, but also a continuation of leaving locals affected out of the decision-making process, implementing policies. Kashgar is one very powerful example, implementing policies that really challenge the ability of Uyghurs and other groups to protect their language, culture, and traditions. And certainly in the aftermath of the work forum, one of the initiatives that Zhang Qinxian announced was the goal to have all Uyghur children or all students in the region fluent in Mandarin by 2020. So to have bilingual education implemented throughout the region by 2015, and to have everyone be able to speak it by 2020, which is a pretty remarkable goal and pretty remarkable development that I think could have serious implications for the future of Uyghur as a vibrant language in the community.
I actually agree with everything that has been said so far. One of the things, though, that I would like to underline is that what happens in Xinjiang isn't really exactly new. You know, we've seen that to some extent already happening in Tibet, you know, where the change of the party leadership in Xinjiang, I don't think really is reflective of a larger policy review or where people basically believe that we have done significant mistakes. The change, in my view, really came about because the violence happened in the first place. And that's exactly what happened in Tibet. Clearly, we had international, in Tibet it was even worse because it was even more widely broadcasted. And, but here we had the pictures, the new technologies that Carl talked about in his opening remarks about the Twitter technology and everything. So that, of course, the response was, okay, well, we have to remove the people that allowed that to happen to begin with. They weren't able to, in essence, sweep it under the carpet or keep it small, at least. And then, of course, the response is very typical. You know, yeah, we're sending more money, we're sending more development, which is basically the justification for Chinese policies, both in Tibet and in Xinjiang, where it is always, look how these people would live without us. Look, like, you know, the feudal system in Tibet, and, you know, they were all poor peasants, you know, that were exploited by a feudal system that was headed by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and, you know, in Xinjiang, exactly the same thing. We're bringing opportunity, we are the ones that move the development forward. And that is really not only true for Tibet and Xinjiang, but that goes for democracy promotion in general. You know, the people benefit from economic opportunities, or this is how the government in general reacts, to provide there's economic growth. So why do you need democracy? Why do you need to speak out? Why do you need to organize yourself? You know, we are providing and we are doing this, and we also expect stability and everybody to go along with it. So that is, I think, rather than a real change in policy, a complete re-emphasis or restatement of what has been going on forever, right? And that's why I don't think that was really such a big surprise.
Right, we have nothing new. I think this is a wonderful chance then to ask Bhuchung to talk about his perspective on what's happening in East Turkestan and
yeah, I thought rather than talking about specifics, I want to talk a little bit broader about the issues of China's nationality policy, as it's called. What happened with the Uyghur people in 2009 and what happened with the Tibetan people in 2008 shows one thing that's very clear, that China's policy towards these people have failed. That brings us to the issue which I want specifically to target. First, the Chinese party and the government at one level, and the ethnic Chinese people at another level, because this is essential, crucial if we want lasting solution to issues like the Tibetans and the Uyghur people. That's because what is the identity of today's People's Republic of China? Is it a multinational state, as the Constitution says? If that is so, does the party accept this in its true sense? Do the ethnic Chinese people really understand what it means by multinational state? And there, I think, there is the need of rethinking and review and a change in the mindset, both of the party and the government at one level, and the ethnic Chinese people at another level. This is because although at the political level, and also I don't want to go beyond the framework of today's discussion by talking about the political aspirations of the Uyghurs or the Tibet, because that's another box of problem, if you will. But here, even within the framework of the People's Republic of China, the constitution, the laws, everything that the Chinese government refers to day in and day out are quite clear in certain ways that everyone is equal. But at another level, there's this mindset that's created that even this very term called nationalities or minority nationalities has this indication that there is one group of people who have a higher authority and then the rest. So there is, I think, a two-China policy today. At one level, that's China for the party and for the rest. At another level, China for the ethnic Chinese and for the rest. As long as this mindset does not change, no matter what patchwork repair they do, whether it's in terms of economic development or whether it's in terms of any other work that the Chinese government does, will not have an impact. And they, I think, our ethnic Chinese brethren have more role in trying to change today's China into the new China, which this People's Republic of China aspires to and has no qualm in broadcasting to the world. And that is the issue that is at stake.
Bhuchung, that's very powerful. I want to say, hello, thank you, Bhuchung. In fact, I interrupt our roundtable now to mention that the two witnesses who spoke earlier in the afternoon have been continuing to listen. They found it fascinating and gratifying to know of all of your interest, and in fact have been told me during the break we made a connection that they actually had another anecdote to tell, and I think it connects very closely to your question about the two-China policy. Ms. Shamsuddin, are you still there?
Yes, I am. Yes, we are hearing and I'm translating what's going on over there. So yes, the witnesses are ready to talk.
Okay, if they can briefly tell their anecdotes, and then we'll have further comments maybe.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Ms. Shamsuddin, I'm not hearing anything now. Are you still?
Okay, now, okay, stop. I just have to interrupt him to translate what he said so far. He's just mentioning about Han and the Uyghur relationship in terms of that one, and it says that, you know, just before I came to USA, and I had one friend's relative who works in Chinese police station, and when they arrest Uyghur people, especially Uyghur students, they just, you know, arrest them. At the beginning, they put a black sort of bag onto top of their head, and they take them away somewhere and just start to beat them or torture them, you know, without saying any word to the students. And then when they take these students to the police station or to custody, and the Chinese police just keep beating them and torture them. And there was another, the Uyghur lady policeman just watching and taking note of the questioning. And that woman told the Chinese police who is beating the student and said, why you keep beating him? How would I take a note? If you do that, how would I go to talk to him? And then soon she said that, and then, you know, the Chinese police told her that Uyghur police lady said she has to leave from there, and she's been sacked from the job. And after that, and also that Chinese police told, and also the student told the Chinese police that why you just keep hitting me, just say something, and then that Chinese police told the Uyghur student, oh, because you're just a Uyghur, you are Uyghur, so that's what's your crime. That I hate you because nobody was able to help you. I can do whatever I wish. Yeah, and from another witness in here.
아니 김민은 교남 말씀에게 별 보시면 이렇게 빨강락 오는 지라에 한수 지라에 보관이 아주 이제 된전이 잠깐 때.
And also, my grandma's neighbor, he's an Uyghur, but he looks a bit Chinese.
아주 예전에 아주 말로나 총열도 백 Xitoylar yig'ilib ketgan ekan, bu maylilar chiqamabdi ekan, shuning uchun bu okash chiqibdi, to'qmoq ko'tarib.
And on the 7th of July, many Chinese mobs took to the streets and they started to attack on Uyghurs. On that day, many Uyghurs were very scared and they were not able to go onto the streets. But because my grandmother's neighbor, he looked a bit Chinese, so he took to the street. He go out the street.
아주 yolda mangsa 아주 Xitoylar 아주 oldida changoga qilibdi. Saqchilar kelib qolsa, changoga chilayib bo'lgan zo'ni ashtada naqsh etdi.
When Chinese police came, the Chinese mobs or the Chinese protesters, and they kind of sing national anthem or national song, saying that we're not going to be slaves, sort of meaning.
이게 삭치마시 ütepkesilem 아주 와가한테 샤스 위주는 이거도 보나려然后又把二道桥那块围着全踏平了。
Soon the Chinese policeman leaves and then they start shouting and screaming that they kill all the Uyghurs. None of them should be left to kill all the Uyghurs.
Lekin o yig'ilib bo'lgandan keyin aşı xilichiq aşı o'ltirayotgan urib aşı yo'lning ko'chalarida ko'rish qolgan aşı Uyg'urlarning hammasini urib o'ltirayotganini ko'rdi. Aniki aşı Xinjiang qilgan tojinlarmi aşı qarshi yo'q aşta qarablam tavuz deb başida pichib başda qarshi yo'q ko'zilmagan ko'rmagandek aşta savoldi deb aşta ko'rdi.
And that person, that Uyghur, also witnessed that loss of Chinese killed many Uyghurs. The dead body was lying on the street. However, the policemen, the special police force who are serving at that time on the streets, they didn't even look at the bodies. They didn't care. They were just eating watermelon on the side of the streets.
Ki opsi aşu bir günde aşu tala çıkıp diye aniki uyga taksini tosup mağandı. Mağansı aniki keşte bir saat diken bağmap diken uyga. Aniki şu saklap durup aniki uydikiler ballar diye birdemde bir bala da xiyal kısa. 2 saat bu geçipti. 2 saat bu geçken tüf vuruptu. Tüf vursa tüfün suyu kwenci. Aniki aşu bizde başta kısa sakçı ma'lum kısmı sakçılar anti közülmay bizden işimiz yok başta burnumda diyendi.
And also another my relative's mother, on the days she went out and caught a taxi, and then she just caught a taxi and she left. She kind of disappeared, and then around 2 hours passed by, but there was no news about her. And then the relatives went to police station and told the police station that, look, this mother went out and catching a taxi, she's disappeared for 2 hours. And the police told the relatives that we don't have time to look for her, or we don't have time to care about such a things.
Aniken aşı topkan yolda aşı birazdan keyin yani tapılmagan aşı közü çözücüne gelip idarsını bir aşı ma'lum qilgan ma'lum qilsa birisi aşı vaqtida qaytib ketgan to'q bir aşı taksichi qaytib kelsa aşı adamni tepib to'saqsalar tepib desa u opamiz qanday desa u gap qilolmay oxirida so'roq qilib qilgan so'roq qilsa meni bolamni shu 5-silada o'ldirayotgan shuning uchun men 10 odamni o'ldirib o'zimni ma'lum qilay degan shu bu opash degan 8-kan to'q ya'ni 8 u opashni urib o'ldirib bir yer tashlashga taksichi.
And then, you know, that woman missing for 1 week, and then the children of that woman looked for her and lately find out which taxi she caught, and she went to that taxi controlling or taxi management system, that station. And then finally they found the driver who caught that old lady, and then they just kind of looked for her and what has happened. Lately that taxi driver, the Chinese taxi driver confessed that she was the 8th woman or 8th person, 8th Uyghur that he killed just because of his one of child dead on that tragedy. So he said that I was going to confess when I killed 10 Uyghur. Now this was the 8th one.
Amsterdam, can you please say thank you to our witnesses for being able to share with us again some stories which clearly point to the pessimistic side of future Han-Uyghur relations, but thank you again to them for sharing their, their stories.
Yeah, they say it's finished too. Yep. Okay. Yep. No problem. I'll do that.
And then this gives us a chance to give Professor Gladney a challenge here. What do you make of what's we've talked about so far?
Well, it's hard to follow up such a moving and horrible story. But I guess just to follow it up with another story, yesterday I was talking with a lawyer, actually a Israeli-Turkish Foundation lawyer, interestingly enough, who is helping a Hui woman in an asylum case, who, and I think what we're seeing, and this is the analogy I'd like to bring to this, the metaphor to this whole incident, is the ripple effects of a huge social earthquake. And this is this sort of international implications that's spilling up onto our shores, the United States, like a tsunami, is the people, like our 2 gentlemen who are giving us this testimony from behind the scenes, and this young Hui woman, are the effects that we're seeing. But they're just ripples on a much larger social scene. We know Xinjiang is an earthquake-prone area, but what we saw on July 5th was a major tectonic shift. And I don't think the area will ever be the same. I think Han-Uyghur relations will never be the same. And I don't think anything the government is doing is going to be able to repair that. I've been saying they're doing more of the same, and it will only lead to more of the same. Back to this Hui woman, she was going to college in Nanjing, and she visited her parents in Linsha, in Gansu, known as the Little Mecca. And she was visiting her parents, and she found a young Uyghur woman on the street whom nobody would care for. She took compassion on her. She took her into her home, discovered that this Uyghur woman had nowhere else to go. Her parents had been killed by police who fired on them point blank, and she witnessed this. She was terrified. Her family was terrified. So she fled, and she couldn't go to any relatives in Xinjiang. She was so afraid of the consequences. So this young Hui woman and her family took her in Linsha, and tried to give her support as a fellow Muslim. And as we know, in Xinjiang itself, Uyghur and Hui relations are not that great. But it's not unusual for Muslims to help Muslims in great times of crisis. And in this case, the entire family has been affected. The neighbors reported that they had harbored this Uyghur woman. The police came. They arrested the young woman and her parents. and they arrested the Uyghur woman. They took her away. They don't know what's happened to her. And the girl was let out. They paid a bribe to get her out on bail. She's required to report to the police every 2 weeks in Ningxia. So she lost her job and her school position in Nanjing. She's supposed to report to Ningxia, but somehow on a student work visa, she was able to come to the United States on a tourist visa, and she cannot go back. So she's claiming asylum. So we see not only just the Uyghur woman's life has been ruined, but 3 other lives, and impacting much wider. I think that what we're seeing in this region is that in the past we've known these earthquakes have taken place, but they were hard to sense, hard to monitor. And despite the internet ban, the close monitoring of communications, now with monitoring stations around the world, even despite internet breakdowns, people are aware of these catastrophes. And we are aware. And thanks to this event and the RFA and other organizations, there is monitoring, there is reporting. And I think that there is no going back. The government cannot just cover this up and act as if this earthquake never happened. And it needs to think much more creatively than it has in the past. I think that there needs to be a total rethinking about the policy in the region. And indeed, as was talked about with the Minzu policy, in China there's been a huge debate now about the whole Minzu policy, an academic and also a political debate, so that they're talking about even dismantling the whole autonomous system. Whether they can or not remains to be seen, whether that's good or not. But I think within China, within the specialists and others, in the broader population, people are really questioning the value of this policy, how it's really held people back to some extent. And over 60 years has not really made a major difference in people's lives. In some cases, you could argue that it's made lives worse.
A quick follow-up to that point, and I wanted to stress as well that one, I don't want to call it an upside, but one consequence of July 5th is more academics, people in think tanks have begun to openly question Minzu policy, and by no means is this a new debate. It certainly existed before July 5th, but there's definitely, this has prompted even more debate. I guess the question is, and certainly debates among government-affiliated think tanks can have an influence on the government. I think the question is whether these debates, and it's promising that they're happening, but whether they will ultimately, or if they will ultimately lead to a concrete change. And right now, it does, as Dr. Gladney mentioned, does look like more of the same on a very hyped up scale. But at the very least, I think this is a promising opening, and it's happening not only among Uyghur academics, but Han academics, academics of other ethnicities, and some lower level ACA officials, and perhaps higher level as well, that we're not as closely aware of.
Yeah, let me respond real quickly. I think this dovetails nicely with Carl Gershman's remarks about Chinese nationalism. Chinese nationalism is really built and structured around this whole notion of Minzu. Of course, it was created to bring China together, originally 5 Minzu, later 56, with the Han as majority. And I think it was Liu Binyan who once called attention to the fact that Chinese nationalism can no longer be based on ideology, such as communism. It's been delegitimated since the fall of the Soviet Union. It can also not be based on things like Confucianism or Buddhism or any other kind of religious ideology. Nothing like that holds China together. So they're really looking to nationalism as a way of bringing China together and managing this enormous population. The problem with that, it's a very hard dragon to ride. And as Liu Binyan once said, he said the way you create nationalism is you single out an internal enemy, an internal other that is threatening to the unity of your state. And unfortunately, I think the Uyghurs and the Tibetans, as they've been portrayed in the media, have been repeatedly shown to be a threat to the Chinese unity of the nation. And this is, I think, why the state so horribly has portrayed these conflicts negatively. In the past, they wanted to celebrate Minzu Tuanjie, united, happy nationalities. Now it's the opposite, because I think the state is threatened. The other way Liu Bian mentioned is external enemies, external threats. So therefore, the United States, or maybe Islamic-inspired terrorism, those kinds of things. So the feeling of anti-Chinese xenophobia, a feeling that China is still trying to be kept weak and blamed for many of the world's problems. So I think these two external and internal threats are key to any nationalist project. And so I think the debate within China about Minzu will really reveal a lot about whether the broader population is buying into this state-sponsored nationalism, or whether there are serious questions being raised.
Jianli, you'll be called upon to talk about that. But so
Drew essentially just made the point that I was going to tack on. Look, I don't think there's an enormous amount of sympathy amongst the Chinese public towards minorities, especially as the state has so systematically and consistently and thoroughly demonized them. I think when you add on top of that the widespread knowledge about the large amounts of money that have been sent to those parts of the country, it's going to be awfully hard to walk back a popular sense that these are ungrateful, uncivilized, untamable minorities who've been the recipients of such government munificence over the years. Why shouldn't we go out and find somebody, who makes Wang Lechuan look like, a warm, fuzzy kind of guy, right? I have a lot of trouble imagining how, even if people, good academics, people at the policy level, realize they've got a much more complex problem on their hands and respond to it, how they get people to buy into it domestically.
All right, so there's the challenge. Jianli, if you can confirm for us, what is the debate like, and what do you think democratic-minded Han Chinese can do?
So the debate has been going on among Chinese intellectuals, including some democracy and human rights activists. Some academics wrongly attribute the tensions in Eastern Turkestan, in Tibet, to the general policy of autonomy. But the opposite is true. So all the trouble actually caused by the Chinese government, the fact that the Chinese government has never realized the autonomy which guaranteed in the PRC's constitution and the regional ethnic autonomy law. And so I think the debate is is very positive from my point of view, because before July 5th incident, there are very few people, if any, in China, especially the elite academics, come out to talk about Uyghur issues. It was a similar situation before March 14th of 2008. Very few people actually talk about the ethnic issues. But now there's debate. That means more people try to come out to discuss this issue. That is a clear indication that many people begin not to believe what the government provides them. So they want to have their own point of view to put it in. So to come to the nationalism, that's a very serious issue. And from day one, the Chinese government never trust the ethnic minorities. I just gave you. I said earlier today, all the party chiefs are Han Chinese. The party, if you understand Chinese politics, you know the party chief has all the power. It's absolutely dominant. So in Xinjiang, in Eastern Turkestan, you can hardly find a party chief of any level that is Uyghur. So from day one, the Chinese government, the CCP, has guarded Uyghurs and other national minorities against minorities as enemies. And in recent years, simply because the vacancy left by the communism ideology, they mobilized nationalism not only to keep the stability, as a way to keep the stability in inner land, but also use it as a strategy of divide and conquer. So the people, leader like Wang Lequan just justify whatever he did in Xinjiang by saying, oh, this is a terrorist. This is terrorist action. Anything, any issue comes to him, he just deny, he just turn away by saying that. So that's the danger we are facing. So Chinese government is favoring compartmentalization on our part. That means all the people who demand democracy in People's Republic of China. I echo 100% to what Carl said earlier today. So without downplaying the issue of national oppression, I have to admit that as a member of the majority, there is a national oppression in these regions. Without downplaying that, in a sense, there's no Uyghur issue, there's no Tibetan issue, there's no ethnic issue. There's only one issue, that's the China issue. That's the issue of a Communist Party, this system. So we cannot get very far without changing this system. In this sense, we have a shared cause. So that's why with the support and the guidance of a National Endowment for Democracy, Initiative for China, and before the Foundation for China in the 21st century, engaged in the massive activities of bringing people together to engage a dialogue. As the Chinese, I think we have to do I'm not only Chinese, but also a democracy and human rights activist who should believe in the universality of our human rights. So the difficulty we are facing is even those democracy and human rights activists ready enough to acknowledge the existence of gross violation of human rights and national oppression are strikingly unready to acknowledge that the minorities have the right to determine their own destiny. So that's something I think as a member of the majority, we have to first engage in soul searching, if you will, and to admit that although the Chinese government has brought sufferings to all the people in China, we have to admit the minority, the so-called minority. Of course, in your own land, you are majority, should be. They have another layer of suffering, which is national oppression, for which probably myself is also responsible to a certain degree. That kind of a soul searching must take place first among Chinese. But I always advocate to my Uyghur brothers and sisters two things. Number one, reach out to the Chinese. I have no problem whatsoever to admit that Uyghurs have every right to determine their own destiny, self-determination. But the reality tells us the Chinese people is the key to the resolution. You have to reach out to talk to Chinese people, to win them over, to talk to people like me, then through me talk to other Chinese people, number one. Number two, we have to stick to the principle of nonviolence, which I think we have to follow the suit of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. He has a very high wisdom to see these 2 points and have been advocating for these 2 points and practice these 2 points. So that's something I want to say. If we do this, if we bring people together, engage the heart-to-heart dialogue, then I think there is hope. And today I brought with me the 2 declarations from the Interethnic Leadership Conference. I'm not going to read it. I may not have time. But the principles that we reached on, we all agreed on, are very great. So the only problem, the question is how to follow through in practice. So I'm happy to announce that we are preparing for the 6th Inter-Ethnic Leadership Conference in coming fall. So thank you.
Thanks. I'd like to ask the audience to think now about questions you may have. I think, Drew, if you have a comment, and then I have a question for Jianli.
Well, I think we have seen a lot of soul searching among the Han in China, and I think that is troubling to the government. This is why the media blitz, which showed the Tibetan riders in such a bad light, and the Uyghurs in such a bad light. I mean, they had plenty of clips of Han killing Uyghurs. And if you look at the numbers, Uyghurs were killed in much higher proportion than Han, although there were more Han apparently killed in the riots than Uyghurs. But the population of Uyghurs in Urumchi is less than 10%. So they're about 25% of the ones who died. And it was a horrible event. And I think Chinese were shocked. And they know when they're seeing only one side. The Chinese population is very sophisticated, as we've seen on the blogosphere. So I think what we're seeing is an internal debate, a lot of soul searching about what is Han, popular Tibetan restaurants and medicines and dance, and there's this sort of renaissance of interest in ethnicity and roots and local cultures in China. That has, I think, prompted a real soul searching over what does it mean to be Han. And I think it's through encouraging that, not encouraging a kind of bifurcated animosity, us versus them, but trying to find ways to dialogue. And I think the saddest thing, the most strategic error on the part of the Chinese government is that they are not willing to engage in dialogue with Uyghurs. This conference talks about having a voice. The meetings in Brussels recently was all about a dialogue with China about the Uyghurs. There is no dialogue. There is no discussion, unlike the Tibet case. It troubles me. But I think it's because the Chinese government is so worried about the Xinjiang problem. They're so insecure in that region. And when you think about what's happening in Kyrgyzstan and Afghanistan, they have every right to be worried. But unless they do something new and not more of the same, I predict they'll have more of the same problems in that region.
Thank you. I think Kara will have a comment, but I double back a little bit and ask Jianli, are you able to tell us something about your own soul searching? In other words, can you give us a sense of how did you turn into the kind of person who can talk to Uyghurs and Tibetans and not like the other Chinese who still need to be able to talk about these things? Is there a story there you can tell?
Thank you for this question. So, as I said earlier, the Chinese government employed a strategy in pursuing its policy. One of it is demonize. Before 1989, the June 4th Tiananmen Square massacre, I almost totally believed what the government told us about the Tibetans, the stories about His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and about Uyghurs. Not much Uyghurs, but at that time they focused on the Dalai Lama because that's not far from 1959 when the Dalai Lama escaped Tibet. So a lot of stories about Dalai Lama himself. So we totally believed in that. But I had a privilege not long after the massacre to meet with His Holiness. And I think many people here have already had privilege in the audience of the Dalai Lama. You know what I mean. When you're in his presence, you know what the Chinese government told you is totally untrue. It's totally wrong. So now I began to give the second thought what the government told us. And we studied the human rights, universality. Why we say the human rights have a universal value. Universal value means, universality means if we don't know our position in the future, for Daokun and myself, or I don't know your Uyghurs, I don't know I'm a Han Chinese, then we decide what policy toward minority. That come up with something. That's human rights. That's universality. So that means if we change our roles, we switch our roles, we understand everything. In Chinese, 要想公道打个颠倒. If you understand, 要想公道打个颠倒, 就是要 switch. Then that time, I was the president of Foundation for China in the 21st century, which engaged in a series of research planning for future China, which involved drafting a constitution for a federal republic, which Carl mentioned in his speech earlier today. Then that involves what is relationship that we are looking at. We are invasion in the future with Tibetans, with Uyghurs, and with the Mongolians. Now I realize this is a series of questions we have to face. So I began to involve with bring the Chinese people to have a meeting with His Holiness, one after another. Then that led to 1998 and then 1999. And I talked to Louisa and Carl and Barbara Haig about the idea to bring more all ethnic groups, younger generation of ethnic groups together to engage the dialogue. First, to enhance mutual understanding of the culture, religion, and history and the current situation. Then we talk about the future that is good to us all. And thank you very much. You support my idea. And we had the first conference that took place in the fall of 2000. Bhuchung and Oma attended. When I see Oma, that occurred to me a story. For this conference, I tried very hard to find the Uyghur brothers and sisters to join the effort. I had extremely difficult time. And I found the names, the phone numbers. I called a few of them. I got very negative reply. And I heard that the Uyghurs, once they come to this country, they would have no dealings whatsoever with the Chinese. But at the end, Bahe, I think somebody know Bahe. He's a Mongolian. He said, I know Oma. Why don't you talk to him? I can be a translator. Because he lived in Eastern Turkestan for a few years. He understand and could speak the language. And I met Oma. Oma said, yes, I want to try. And he bring the Uyghurs to the first conference. That's the very beginning. Thank you, Oma. And in one sense, I think Ms. Kadia mentioned that in one of the meetings I had with her. Said, we are all victims of Chinese Communist Party's policy. They divide and conquer. And many, I think most of the Chinese have never had any experience dealing with Uyghurs and Tibetans. But I don't know why they hate them. And a lot of Uyghurs may not have a chance to live together with the Hans, but they have a resentment. So in this sense, we are all victims. We have to realize that. And we have to overcome it. We have to come together. Our strength is in the unity, because we are facing the same problem, as I said earlier. There's only one issue, that's the China issue.
Thanks. I just wanted to follow up and emphasize that I think it's important, while Uyghur groups who choose to do so reach out to Chinese, that it would be great to see more, especially rights defenders inside China, taking up Uyghur causes. And they need not be sensitive, hot buttons, state security cases, but run-of-the-mill and not so run-of-the-mill things like job discrimination. There are some great lawyers in China who are working on job discrimination based on sex or height or health status. And to my knowledge, job discrimination based on ethnic status is largely, if not wholly, overlooked. And so, while I understand that rights defenders, it's a very brave group and they walk a very fine line, I think there are openings and ways to engage with Uyghur communities in China and take up issues like this. And similarly, outside of China, well, on the one hand, I think there are commonalities, as we've all stressed. There are also very unique historical circumstances that brought Xinjiang to where it is today, and some differences that I think are worth recognizing. But at the same time, this is a Chinese human rights issue in the sense that Xinjiang is today a part of China, and I think it sometimes gets marginalized as such. It is sometimes seen as a special issue, a boutique issue, if you will. It's kind of off to one side. It's not really part of China. And I think that can be unfortunate in the sense that Xinjiang can really get overlooked. So we have great programs in the U.S. and overseas that provide support for development efforts, legal reform, all sorts of great programs working in China, programs to give scholarships to Chinese citizens. And I think that Xinjiang can sometimes get left out of that. It's just seen as something separate, something apart, when in fact, I think what happens in Xinjiang speaks volumes about the nature of the Chinese government as a whole. So I hope that's something that we can see more of in coming years.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kara. That's really where I'm going now. We're going to have a few more minutes where we can ask our panelists to think, or roundtable participants to think a little bit more about whether you want to mention what can be done, what should be done. And but I'll pause first to see whether any member of the audience wants to raise an issue that you want to put on the agenda. All right. I see Henry in the back. Henry, go ahead. Can you wait for the microphone for a second?
This is Henrik Krzyzewski with the Uyghur Human Rights Project. My question is, how can Han Chinese and Uyghur civil society dialogue be initiated within East Turkestan itself?
All right, well, people think about that. I want to ask Hans to say something about what can be done, perhaps at the policy level.
Yeah, I think one of the issues that we have not yet discussed is really the role of the U.S. government. I mean, what can the U.S. government do to further, of course, the dialogue that we've heard so much about, and second of all, what can we do independently to address the human rights situation? Now, one thing certainly that isn't helpful is to go out to China and say, you know what, human rights isn't really going to be so much of our issue anymore. Right? That really is rather counterproductive. Now, what I do think though is helpful is if we ask the Chinese authorities and the Chinese government to do things that would ultimately fall within, the international legal framework and would establish China more as a respected member of that club of a family of nations, basically, that would adhere to at least the minimum standards, right? Without it being such a big deal to ask these things. One of the things that Congress is doing right now, and you may be aware of this, before Congress is pending House Resolution 953 that Congressman Jim McGovern has introduced, that of course, was drafted to in mind with the 1 year anniversary that is coming up, but that also makes very concrete proposals of what the U.S. government can do. The U.S. government could very well ask the Chinese government to release the names of the prisoners or the people that are detained, that we don't know where they are, what their medical condition is, what they were exactly charged with, if they were arrested or if they're just held, or if they're being held without any legal justification, right? The second thing is, of course, is that the U.S. government and our embassy could go and routinely request to observe trials where there are legitimate and sensitive human rights issues at stake. Why would we be excluded? Why should we not ask routinely, as a matter of policy, to go and say, we want to observe these things so that they don't happen in secret, so that we don't find out how many people are executed and may not even know the exact number. We do not know how many people were arrested and are still being detained in the aftermath of the violence. And of course, in order to achieve this, I think it's a very reasonable approach to ask the Chinese government about a US consulate in Urumchi, for example. You know, we obviously had, and that's a simple and practical step. We know that China is interested in opening more consulates here in the United States. Great. You know, international custom is, not law, but custom is that there's a parity. You get so many, then we open also one somewhere else. Now, to be absolutely clear, the Tibetan Policy Act already makes it a matter of policy for the United States to seek a to seek a consulate in Tibet. That's great, and we need to do that, and that's a very reasonable ask. I mean, this is not like, you know, we're trying to undermine your regime or the authority of, you know, China or whatnot. This is just to open a consulate. The same goes for Urumchi. Why can't we have a consulate there? Now, I do know that our embassy went out there during the violence, and then, you know, they stay there and report and then go back to Beijing. But that's a really rather awkward thing, and, you know, it's not exactly around the corner either. So somebody needs to go out there. But why don't we have a permanent presence there? And this is one of the things that actually benefits both Han and Uyghurs, because, you know, if Han Chinese want to travel to the United States, they have to go all the way out to Beijing. Why can that not be done as a technical matter, right? And it would really improve that. So there are things that we can do, and I think there are reasonable things that can be asked that would be really hard to be denied by the Chinese government if they are proposed in a reasonable way. So now our resolution, again, HRS 953, is proposing that. And we hope that we get the support for this. And, you know, if you have time, I certainly urge you to call your members of Congress and, you know, make sure that that we get the necessary support to bring it up and pass it. But those are all things that I think the U.S. government can easily do, and the Chinese government could do as well, to underline that it is really serious in, you know, in pursuing the goals that it says it has in Xinjiang.
Don't hold your breath. The Brits had a consulate in Kashgar and the Russians in Yili, or Gulja. The U.S. has never had a presence out in that region. Maybe Xi'an would not be beyond the horizon, but I doubt Lhasa or Urumchi anytime soon. And I think the U.S. acting alone, given the nature of U.S.-China relations at this period, is not in a great position to bargain or to impose its will on China. However, I think working with international organizations can actually make a difference, because China is very concerned about its image in the world, just for the purposes of doing business. I'm a member of the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Councils, and I've just been asked to be a member of their new Global Agenda Council on Human Rights, meeting in Dubai. This is their 4th meeting, and these help set the agenda for the Davos meetings. And of course, the participants in Davos are very influential in shaping world opinion, as well as in local government policies. So I think those kinds of agendas, the UNPO meeting in Brussels, although China was not present, I think those kinds of international fora are very, very important for shaping world opinion and making the Xinjiang problem on top of the agenda, and that's what I intend to do in Dubai this fall.
Wonderful. Anyone else? Response to Henry or chance for closing comments? Thank you.
Just wanted to add another thing that people could do, and that's again at the broader level, both outside here in the United States as well as within China. I think there is a need for an effort to desensitize the issues of the Tibetan people or the Uyghur people, because we see attempts by the Chinese government to make these issues appear so sensitive that people hesitate the next time in touching them. And there seems to be an apparent trend in Washington, D.C. now towards this. In May, there was this bilateral human rights dialogue, and I was listening to the press conference or the briefing thereafter by the person charged with human rights role here in Washington, D.C., who refuses to even utter some names. So if that is the extent of how the United States is looking at issues relating to China or issues relating to people like that we are discussing here, then it'll be very tough for the people themselves to be able to do anything. And again, I go back to our Chinese people, because I think if at all there is going to be any lasting change by the Chinese government on issues like ours, I think it is, dare I say the word, responsibility of the ethnic Chinese people to make mainstream public debate on these issues more common, so that the leadership, if at all they are listening to the voice of the people, will be forced to tackle them in a different way. Because with the Chinese government being able to sort of bend the people's perception, I think it becomes more challenging for others to really hope for anything. And that is where I think the Chinese government would like the things to be. And for all of us, that's the challenge that we need to think about.
Thank you so much, Bhuchung. It's you've brought us to a wonderful place where we can close our program today. I want to say thank you to all of our deeply involved experts, people who are not only expert on the facts, but also, try to be close and keep their ears and their hearts open to the voices of those who otherwise do not have a hearing in the world. And I think we've accomplished our goal today. We started out a long time ago in the early afternoon saying we wanted to remember what happened on July 5th. We wanted to help uncover the truth that had been covered up and deliberately distorted, that we wanted to allow people to bear witness, to allow Uyghurs to have a voice, that we wanted to stand in solidarity, and we did want to look to the future. I think you've all of you, including the audience, have done a great job helping us do that. Please join me in thanking our participants.